So this is Kim Malville. I'm an emeritus professor in the Department of Astrophysics and Space Sciences, Planetary Sciences. And I'd like to welcome you all to the, I think it's the 18th seminar that the Retired Faculty Association has been organizing with the distinguished professors of the university. As speaking for myself, as just an ordinary professor, I think all of us are very impressed by those who have been among us who have been designated as distinguished, and Tom Veblen is one of those that is very deserving in that designation. Each of us as professors every year would get an annual review of our teaching, our research, and our community engagement, our community outreach. And Tom has been marvelously successful in joining the last two categories, namely his research has been of great importance and use for the community in terms of fire management and forest ecosystem. And I think there are many organizations who are involved in fire control management who look upon Tom as a major resource. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Tim Seestad, a environmentalist at Instar, to introduce his colleague and friend, Tim.
Okay, thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for tonight's Distinguished Professor Seminar, Dr. Thomas Veblen. Tom received the Distinguished Professor title in 2017 as a result of 4 decades of scholarly research on what has become a topic of major concern. His work encompasses biogeography, forest ecology, landscape ecology, and the ecological aspects of global environmental change. Tom received all 3 of his degrees from the University of California at Berkeley. It was there that he initiated what might be called a lifelong quest, asking how humans and disturbances such as fire interacted with variability to produce a dynamic structure and functioning of our forested landscapes. So Tom has a strong international dimension in his research, starting with his dissertation that involved management of forests in Guatemala. This work was followed then by studies in Chile and New Zealand. He joined CU in 1981 and has maintained research programs in South America and New Zealand. These have been funded by a continuous series of grants from the National Science Foundation to him and to his students. Early on, these studies generated a paradigm shift in the way we think about forests and the way we should manage both north latitude and south latitude temperate forests. If I was to summarize what's special about Tom's work, it's that he studied forests at temporal and spatial scales that very few other scientists have attempted. And as it turns out, this scale is really essential for his questions and the key to understanding forest dynamics. Tom's impact on his field goes well beyond his contributions to the literature. We might call him a particularly fecund academic, as he's produced about 40 PhD scientists. These CU grads have been both successful and productive, occupy positions at R1 universities and federal research institutions, both nationally and internationally. As you're very aware, the current local and regional manifestation of the climate crisis involves the threat of catastrophic fire. We no longer have to be warned that this has serious implications for the Front Range. Tom's work provides the framework for proactive planning in this crisis, and that is the topic of tonight's talk. So Tom, please tell us about Front Range wildfires, global warming, and forest ecology.
Oops. First, I'll try and get my slides started, but thanks very much, Kim, for organizing this. And thank you, Tim, for that very flattering and embarrassing introduction. I hope you have not created expectations that are too high for this evening. Let's see if I can get this to start. Yeah. Okay, so first I want to thank the many recent grads and postdoc collaborators whose work I'm going to be highlighting this evening. And as everyone already is well aware, and as illustrated in this map, we're really seeing a fundamental change over the last 30, 40 years in the area burned in the Front Range. So this map divides our recent fire history into 2 time periods. Many of you will probably remember the Tiger Gulch fire from 1989, which was sort of the first wake-up call in our area. That was when there was a big push for increased training for firefighters to work in wildland firefighting in our region. And compared to the last 18 years, we're in a whole new dimension. These article titles received a lot of media attention in just the last few weeks locally. And they make the point, the first article on the basis of tree ring reconstructions, that our current so-called mega drought of the last 22 years is the driest 22-year period since the 800s. The paper below, produced by a group of researchers based in Colorado. Many of these people either work for or with the Forest Service, and using very standard and widely accepted modeling techniques for projecting both climate and fire response to climate, they're emphasizing that the exceptional fire seasons like 2020 will become more likely, and wildfire activity under future extremes is predicted to exceed anything yet witnessed. I'm going to try and minimize the bad news, okay? So I got that out of the way at the beginning. I want to emphasize that there are some things that we can actually do to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change. There's obviously no guarantee, and I certainly don't have answers, but there are some reasons to think optimistically about addressing some of these problems. So I'll make a couple comments about the context of this talk, and then I'll go through disturbance history in the Northern Front Range here, and then end with a section on pathways forward. So by translational ecology, I'm referring to the sustained and iterative engagement of researchers with practitioners and stakeholders. And I've got one example here on the left. This is an historical range of variability report that we produced over several years of interacting with Forest Service personnel. And it really summarizes some of the information I'm going to summarize tonight on fire history, history of insect outbreaks, and so on. And HRV turns out to be a very important sort of criteria that's being applied in management decisions today. And then more recently, a group of us with very contrasting opinions on a lot of fire science worked together for about 2.5 years, and with a number of facilitated meetings to produce a report that emphasizes where there is common ground among fire researchers. And there are 3 highlights that I'm going to be emphasizing tonight. And that is this mantra of fight fire with fire. There's strong agreement on that point. There's strong agreement that our management decisions are totally place-dependent, context-dependent, and that we can't just offer generalizations that could be applied everywhere. And then based on the abundant feedback that we had from land managers as part of this project, over the last several years, it's become obvious that coping with climate change is the big challenge. Then more locally, I wanted to point out, and I see that there are some people on this Zoom, fortunately, who are involved in this partnership. St. Vrain Forest Health Partnership is a local partnership. It's one of the many collaboratives that have been developed over the last 20 years or so to try and engage communities with land managers. The most recent trend has been to emphasize cross-boundary, meaning cross-land ownership approaches. And I wanted to point out that currently there is a proposal, a project being developed locally by the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest for the St. Vrain Forest Health Project. And this will be put up for public comment, I believe quite soon. I had a look at a draft of it and critiqued the draft thanks to the interaction that I've had with the St. Vrain Forest Health Partnership. But one of my goals tonight is to provide some information for stakeholders to be more involved in the commenting on this proposed project, which will be funded by millions and millions of dollars and is expected to run for about 20 years. So I'm going to go over some of the basics on our local fire history here. So this diagram shows the gradient in vegetation from the lower montane forests that are characterized by ponderosa pine up through what we call the upper montane zone. The forest is described as mixed conifer. It's still got plenty of ponderosa pine in it, but it's mixed with Doug fir, some aspen, some limber pine, a little bit of lodgepole pine. And then we have our subalpine forests that are characterized by subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. So at the lowest elevations there, the transition from the foothills into the lower montane zone, we've sampled fire history in these relatively open woodlands of ponderosa pine. This is adjacent to El Dorado Springs here. And we cut samples. This happens to be from a stump. We did not kill that tree when we cut it, but we take non-destructive samples. So partial cross sections from living trees and carefully, tediously date the fire scars in those tree ring records. So this just shows some of the sort of raw data, which is easier to appreciate when it's summarized in this sort of diagram, where it just shows the number of trees that were scarred over time period, in this case from 1600s up to late 1990s, when we did most of the data collection. And as you can see, we had frequent fires in this area, which is about 113 hectares at low elevations, 1900 meters. And there's been variability, although it's called a frequent fire regime. There has been significant variability in the frequency of those fires. So in most decades, we had at least one fire per year. But then there was a long time period from the late 1700s to about 1840 where we only had a single fire. So when we describe our lower montane zone as characterized as a frequent fire regime, characterized by low severity, meaning non-lethal fires to mature trees, we have to recognize that there's been a lot of variability in that frequency. Then note in the second half of the 19th century, a big increase in the frequency of fires. And then as you can see here, fire suppression really is strongly reflected in our tree ring record. The upper diagram just shows the number of trees that established in different time periods. And you can see very sporadic small numbers of trees establishing up until we get into the fire suppression period. So this is in support of what's referred to as tree encroachment during the fire suppression, modern fire suppression period. It's easier to appreciate with some repeat photos. So this shows Red Rocks and Mount Sanitas in about 1897 and in 2022. And you can see substantial tree encroachment on the western side of Mount Sanitas and in the foreground near Red Rocks. This shows the eastern slope of Mount Sanitas in 1884 and then again in 2022. And I look at this and I see relatively modest changes. So I just want to point out that we have not had sort of a wholesale replacement of grasslands by dense stands of ponderosa pine. Now the lower montane zone This is described as a low severity historical fire regime, meaning high frequency but low severity. It refers to the area mostly below about 7,500 feet, but don't hold me to any of these elevations. They're all approximate and they vary depending on aspect and other topographic factors. So the sources of ignition included both lightning and Native American set fires. The largest fire years lagged wet years. So the largest fire years in the tree ring record occur 1, 2, or 2 years following the tree ring reconstructed climate indicating moist conditions. And I think this is not surprising to anybody who paid attention to the Marshall Fire that followed a very wet spring. So this area is sort of the iconic setting for mechanical fuels reduction and prescribed underburning to try and remove fuels and reduce the potential of crown fires, which many people, of course, now realize are very effective at sending embers long distances to ignite fires elsewhere. When we move into the upper montane zone, above around 7,500 feet, we have a fire regime which is a historical fire regime that is much more complicated. Mixed severity fire regime, so that means that there were some low severity surface fires, but there also were significant high severity fires. And when I use the term high severity fire here, I mean fires where we've reconstructed from the tree rings that at least 40% of the canopy trees were killed. In many cases, more than 70% of the canopy trees were killed. So this diagram here just contrasts the fire frequency between the upper montane zone and the lower montane zone for a couple of selected sites. You can see that we had periods of around 100 years without any evidence of fire in these upper montane stands. And again, we do see a very effective manifestation of fire suppression after 1900. To put this into perspective in terms of the amount of change in forest cover during most of the 20th century, one of my recent students, Kyle Rodman, did an air photo comparison centered on sites where we've measured fire history. So we know what the fire history was at those sites covered by the air photos, and showed that there's been about a 16% increase in forest cover in the lower montane zone sites, but a 12% increase in forest cover in the upper montane zone sites. So I'm trying to emphasize that there were some open areas in the upper montane zone, illustrated by this photo here. So there's been some meadow invasion in the upper montane zone, but much less than what we see in the, or somewhat less than what we see in the lower montane zone. So the map on the left here covers the northern Front Range, got Boulder located here for reference. And the dots indicate sites where my very energetic students have over many decades collected fire scar samples. And then from those fire scar samples, we used a biophysical modeling approach to extrapolate where fires were low severity, meaning high frequency in the past, and where they were of the mixed severity fire regime type. And the yellow you can see is the mixed severity fire regime, which is by far the largest part of our montane zone. So this map covers the entire montane zone. It's basically the upper limit for the distribution of ponderosa pine. The ages of trees that we've determined in a whole series of studies shows that most trees established prior to fire suppression, prior to 1920. That's when we're determining that fire suppression really became effective. It varies from the lower montane zone to the mid-montane and upper montane. There's more establishment after fire suppression, as you would expect in the lower montane zone. But in the upper montane zone, as you can see better in this diagram, beginning in the 1860s, we had a huge increase in tree establishment. That's in response to an increase in fire activity in the second half of the 19th century, which I showed in that previous diagram. And that applies both to the stands we characterize as having a history of high severity fire and also stands of a moderate severity. That'd be like where we only had 40-some% of the trees killed by fire. So again, it's easier to appreciate this with some photos. This is the same figure that I showed you before, but now I want to draw your attention to the increase in the frequency of the histogram bars in the second half of the 19th century. This is a time period of synchronous drought and fire all across the Western United States. We've documented this in metadata analysis by combining our fire history data with that of many other researchers. And you can see in this example, 1905 photo in upper left-hand canyon showing that our mixed conifer forest was capable of supporting a high severity fire. So I just want to disabuse people of the notion that we didn't have any high severity fires until we had fire suppression in the 20th century. This is an example with Gold Hill in the background. Photo was taken in 1925. Notice this mining structure here, and you can see the same location over here. And this is a typical pattern that we see in the upper montane zone, forests that had been cut and logged during the, cut and burned during the 19th century. So we had both climate conditions that were conducive to fire in the second half of the 19th century, and we also did have an increase in ignition sources related to mining activities. And as you can see, this is an area where we have extremely good resilience of the forests, at least following 19th century burning. Very good recovery of a mixture of Doug fir, ponderosa pine, a little bit of lodgepole in there too. The upper series here shows Sugarloaf Mountain area. In 1905, this area had been burned from our tree ring reconstructions in 1860, and then smaller fires occurred subsequently, also in the 19th century. The 1860 fire was the fire that burned Gold Hill right when it was recently established. And again, you can see very good resilience of to stands that formerly were dense stands and that had originated from earlier fires. This is an upper left-hand canyon just at the mouth of California Gulch, where the Dewdrop mine was located. You can see some of the evidence of the massive amount of cutting that was necessary to fuel these mills. And this was taken 1896. And I believe that this is the same fire that started in 1894 that nearly burned Gold Hill, and is a very important part of their sort of shared history of fire. And again, good recovery to dense mixed conifer stands. In the subalpine zone, we have a much simpler fire regime and a much greater degree of agreement on its characteristics. So let's say above around 9,300 feet in spruce and fir and lodgepole pine forests, fires are infrequent. They're stand replacing fires, sometimes killing 100% of the trees over large areas. They're driven by extreme drought, which in the past was only occurring a couple times per century. These fires are limited by weather. They're not limited by fuels. And the reconstruction of fire history in the subalpine forests show that the intervals, the fire-free intervals between fires is consistently well over 100 years, and in many cases, well over 300 years. So see Long's Peak in 1916 here, recently burned, and in 2021. One of my former grad students, Jason Seibold, who's now a faculty member at CSU, did an extensive census and reconstruction of fire history using tree rings that covered the southern 2/3 of Rocky Mountain National Park. And this allowed him to map areas of past fire. And this is just one example. The dark gray here, close to the town of Grand Lake, shows that in 1851, nearly all the lodgepole pine zone in the southwestern part of Rocky Mountain National Park burned in a single year. So based on that kind of historical information, it's not that surprising that a very large proportion of the same area burned again in the East Troublesome fire of 2020. This photo is taken from the peak of Deer Mountain in Rocky Mountain National Park. So now we're on the eastern side of the park, looking at the Continental Divide, and you can see in 1888, very large, slowly recovering burn patch. In 2020, you can see that it's still slowly recovering. You can see over here, there's been recovery, but not complete recovery. But then the 2020 East Troublesome fire came along and burned the same area again. An important aspect of the East Troublesome fire, which has everyone worried, is that it crossed the Continental Divide. So it crossed several miles of an area without any fuels. Okay, so switching to the topic of insect outbreaks, which has received a lot of attention since the beginning of our large outbreaks in the late 1990s. We have both illustrated here: mountain pine beetle, which attacks and kills ponderosa pine and also lodgepole pine, and then spruce beetle, which affects Engelmann spruce at higher elevations. And as I'm sure most people are aware, we had a really massive outbreak of mountain pine beetle, mainly in lodgepole pine stands that began around the year 2000. And then beginning a little bit later and continuing a little bit later, we had a massive outbreak of spruce beetle. Beginning in the mid-1980s, we developed tree ring techniques to reconstruct the long-term history of spruce beetle outbreaks. And this is our most recent paper using those techniques, which is based on data sampled all across Western Colorado, basically. And it essentially just shows that in addition to that modern spruce beetle outbreak, we had spruce beetle outbreaks of similar magnitude in the 1940s, when fire suppression had not had much of an impact. And in the 19th century, we had extensive areas of spruce beetle outbreak. In the case of mountain pine beetle, Jose Negron and Lori Huckabee, Forest Service scientists, recently published this paper using similar techniques to show that the mountain pine beetle outbreaks in the northern Front Range were just as frequent and just as extensive in the late 19th century to early 20th century, long before any fire suppression, as they were in our recent outbreak, which they've dated at 2012. In that HRV report that I showed in one of my first slides, we included this figure, which is a reconstruction based on tree rings of spruce budworm, which is a defoliator, which in our region attacks, kills some Doug fir, but some Doug fir also survive, which gives us a tree ring signal to reconstruct outbreaks. And this shows the percentage of sites recording those outbreaks for both the southern and the northern Front Range, based on quite a large sample size, I think 20-some study sites. And you can see that we have a long history of severe spruce budworm outbreaks. They're not limited to the fire suppression era. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about pathways forward using a framework which has become very popular in conservation science for sure, and seems to be gaining broader acceptance in the land management community as well. This is the Rad Framework, It's the resist change, accept change, or direct change in terms of how we should try to address climate-induced changes, ecological trajectories. So the first, the resist change basically, in most cases, means restore ecosystems on the basis of the historical range of variability, or on some acceptable current conditions. But the incorporation of HRV is really almost part of the philosophy of people who are in this business now. So this requires proactive management. And in contrast, accept the change means allow the ecosystems in response to climate change to drift without intervening to alter that trajectory. This is sort of part of a philosophy which is being stressed today by some people, where they want to rely more on nature-based solutions. Then the direct change means actively shape responses to trajectories to create new desired future conditions. That again requires proactive management, means intervention, means lots of costs, and so on. All three of these approaches require continuous monitoring and what's called adaptive management, which essentially just means change your course based on new information. Then all of these discussions about whether to resist, accept, or direct change need to incorporate what's called a social ecological systems framework, which means all the decisions are going to be based on social values ultimately. So I want to just walk through some trends that are established and then just offer what my first take would be if I was having a conversation with people about how to apply the Rad framework to possibly address these trends. So these are sites of permanent forest plots that we established on Niwot Ridge in the early 1980s, and we've been censusing ever since. And you can see this is mean annualized tree mortality from 1980 to, I think, 2020. These data are in a paper just recently published, led by a recent grad student, Robbie Andrus. And we analyze the data according to different stand types, whether they're young, whether they're old, whether they're dominated by lodgepole pine, or dominated by spruce and fir. And the common pattern that we are seeing is an increase in tree mortality, especially over the last 15 or 20 years. We started our study a bit earlier, but going back, I want to point out that in 1999, the Forest Service began a massive program of monitoring forest plots called their Forest Inventory Analysis Project. And a census of thousands of plots was recently published showing that more than half of the tree species in the Western United States since 1999 are showing increases in tree mortality rates. So also in the Niwot Ridge area, Robbie Andrus destructively sampled 1,000 or so tree seedlings to determine the years in which they established. And he was able to reconstruct what are peaks of establishment indicated by these black triangles from about 1940 to close to 2010. And for subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce, you can see there are very few triangles since we moved into a warmer, drier period in the 1980s. So under warmer and drier conditions, we're seeing fewer opportunities for spruce and fir to establish. So this would be described as a decline in the resiliency. So using that sort of information, if we were going to have a conversation based on Rad, my first take would be, okay, I think we should just accept this, but continue to monitor it. So far, the monitoring does not show any significant decline in biomass in our plots, and likewise, the flux tower gas exchange measurements in the same area show that the forest continues to be a carbon sink. This is an area where we might have some hope for a nature-based solution based on the upward shift in drought-tolerant populations, either populations of the same species that are more drought-tolerant or other species, but slowly over a long period of time. And I'd say, let's think about assisted migration, actual planting in the future, but the cost of that, the cost of silvicultural operations to open up areas to make seedling establishment feasible would be fairly significant right now. So another trend is the increasing tree mortality from bark beetles. Our work shows that they're natural feature, the dynamics of our forest, but there's no doubt that under warmer, drier climatic conditions, we're getting an increase in tree-killing bark beetle outbreaks. This is from a manuscript that's currently in revision, led by Kyle Rodman. There are 26 authors, including many Forest Service scientists, where it's a metadata analysis from all these sites in the southern Rocky Mountain region. And it's where people sampled the forests before the outbreak, the pre-outbreak species composition is indicated here, each color representing different species: spruce, lodgepole pine, subalpine fir, and aspen. And then they also sampled the same areas following the outbreak. And sort of the most important take-home message is where I've put in this little red underline. That's the area of change to non-forest. So 15 to 20 years ago, when people were talking about the beetle outbreaks being destructive to forests, that really has not been the case. We've had significant changes in the forest composition, the species composition. The big winner generally has been aspen. Most forest managers are very happy to have more aspen in the landscape because it is a buffer against fire. Doesn't always stop fire, but it reduces the potential for fire spread. And obviously it's a buffer against these bark beetle outbreaks that attack the conifers. So, and this is a future trajectory based on the standard sort of simulation model used by forest managers. So we have not had wholesale conversion of forest to non-forest resulting from these bark beetle outbreaks. Now there is a trend of an increase in overlap between beetle kill and subsequent fire. And that's simply because we've had so much beetle kill. Anytime you have a fire in the subalpine zone, it's very likely that it's going to overlap with the beetle kill. So what I might, on a first take, suggest is I think we're going to have to accept that trend, which may be resulting in a lack of conifer regeneration in some places, which is what we showed in the San Juans based on the West Fork fire that occurred in 2013 that burned in this area of the San Juans, where there's been a massive beetle outbreak and tree kill. Most of the area regenerated to aspen, but there are some stands where there was no aspen in the understory. So those are likely going to be long-lasting meadows, open areas. So this is what all of us are concerned about in the case of the East Troublesome and the Cameron Peak 2020 fires. Studies are underway to see whether or not we observe good regeneration in the beetle kill areas following fire. The explanation for it is that the beetles kill the seed trees. There are no seeds then for post-fire regeneration. So this is the kind of thing that needs to be continued to be monitored. So some of you undoubtedly will be thinking, well, what about the fire hazard or fire risk that might be affected by beetle kill? And every time we read something in the media about fire, there usually is some statement about, well, the fire burned through beetle kill. And the implication is that the beetle kill either contributed to the fire spread or to fire severity. Our research group started doing field-based empirical studies of the question of whether or not fire severity is greater after beetle kill or not. We started doing them based on the 2002 fires in northwestern Colorado. Most recently, we did it with the West Fork 2013 fire. The headline tells you the results. Fire severity unaffected by spruce beetle outbreak. At a subcontinental scale, in this paper led by Sarah Hart, the area burned in the Western United States is unaffected by recent mountain pine beetle outbreaks. That's based on overlay analysis of where we've had mountain pine beetle occurrence from 2000 to 2012 and fire. No one, I wouldn't say no one, but many people just don't believe me when I say that all of the published studies based on actual field data have failed to support the expectation, the hypothesis that we would have significantly more severe fire following beetle kill. And I wanted to cite some work by another group to show that we're not alone in our findings. So this is work that was done in the Pacific Northwest, and this quote says, specifically, in most cases following mountain pine beetle activity, fire likelihood is neither higher nor lower than in non-mountain pine beetle affected forests. That doesn't mean that we should just neglect beetle kill as a factor that certainly affects how people might want to combat fires, but we should not assume that beetle kill is significantly increasing fire risk or the risk of more severe fires. So the trend that keeps many of us awake at night is the increase in wildfires. There's widespread acceptance in the research community that no matter what we do, we're going to see a dramatic, sustained increase in areas burned at high severity. So using the Rad framework, I'd start out with a discussion of where we might want to resist with mechanical treatments and prescribed fires, but emphasize, and I think that this is actually gaining much greater support in the land management community compared to where we were 20 years ago. We have to focus on strategic locations. So it means prioritize the wildland-urban interface, high-value infrastructure, such as surrounding reservoirs, communication and power infrastructure, and so on. The challenges even to that, though, are the smoke, limitations on air quality, the safety, very narrow windows of weather that are suitable for safely burning. I would argue that that approach is unlikely to be effective in the non-WUI areas. So let's say in much of the upper montane zone, but the part of the zone that's outside of the WUI, let's say, and certainly not in subalpine areas. And I would say that based on the recent studies, mostly modeling based, that emphasize the importance of continued extreme fire weather. There are also important operational limits to that sort of mechanical treatment and prescribed burning approach in these higher elevation areas. And I've just naming a couple here. One is a duration of effects. Usually the reduction in fuels is regarded as having an influence on fire behavior, significant influence on fire behavior for maybe 10 to 20 years. So it means that areas would have to be treated frequently. And as has been pointed out in an analysis by one of the postdocs from my lab, Tanya Schonagel, the probability of fires intersecting the treated areas is quite low. On average, about 1% of fires in the Western United States intersect a treated area, which means that the area to be treated, if we really want fires to intersect them, would have to be just exponentially increased, which is not likely to happen for all sorts of reasons. Then the final point here is it's just a major problem which is not being addressed, and that's the unintended consequences of fuels reduction through mechanical thinning, sometimes with or without prescribed burning. This is a quote from a review paper recently published by Beverly Law and a very distinguished group of ecosystem ecologists, where they conclude that broad-scale thinning to reduce fire severity conflicts with climate goals. It's based on the observation that these sorts of fuel treatments are removing biomass to reduce fuels, and that's biomass that is needed to store, to absorb carbon. So this is a real conundrum, which in my opinion is not being adequately addressed. So the same trend, increase in wildfires. I've tried to say that we want to prioritize some strategic locations for the resistance approach. And here I'm suggesting that the mantra of fight fire with fire makes a lot of sense. Basically, everyone in this field supports greater use of managed wildfire. That means letting some ignitions continue to spread. But as you can imagine, there are some challenges, but also some opportunities to greater use of managed wildfire. The planning for this has dramatically improved over the last 10 years. The technology that's been developed for wildfire risk assessment to create what are called strategic response zones for firefighting decisions has really improved based on much better real-time observations and weather forecasting and use of much better fire behavior models. So that's been used in our recent fires, these troublesome and the Cameron Peak fires, to make decisions on whether to let an area burn or to make the protect decision. This is the acronym, which took me a while to figure out what it meant. For this is PODS. Those are potential operational delineations. Those are mapped areas where it is expected that fire behavior could be affected by natural features, ridge tops, in this case, Continental Divide, which didn't do too well in these troublesome fire, but other features that we would expect to somehow buffer the spread of a fire. And it could be areas that have been treated, or more importantly, areas that have been recently burned. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for the application of this PODS approach, and I think there's a lot of need for further research to figure out just what the resource benefits might be in applying the PODS approach. Again, the key limitation, I think everyone agrees to on the application of more managed fire, is our ability to manage those fires under extreme weather. And again, technology is sort of on our side in terms of getting much more rapid detection of fires so that decisions can be made. But when you look at a fire like these troublesome, which spread 100,000 acres in one day, that's sometimes described as consuming 70 football fields per minute, if that means anything to us. And this shows the same area, the Comanche Valley in 2021. So you can imagine that under future extreme fire weather conditions, even our best planning is going to have limited impact. So the final trend that I want to talk about very briefly is the evidence for declining resilience of dry montane fires. And resilience, like restoration, are words that tend to be abused, but here we mean post-fire recovery. There have been a number of studies conducted that my lab has been a part of, from the northern through the southern Rockies, which show that, as the title indicates here, a changing climate is snuffing out post-fire recovery in montane forests. So we're seeing larger and larger areas of what we would call regeneration failures, natural regeneration failing. This is now a very widely accepted finding. There's a lot of interest in it from land managers, and they want to make decisions about, well, where could they hope for and perhaps depend on natural regeneration, or where should they invest the substantial resources required for planting, for artificial reforestation. And there are tools being developed to help in that process. People interested can go online and just Google the Southern Rockies Reforestation Tool, which was recently created by Kyle Rodman. It's hosted on a Forest Service website now. And you can enter some information. You can designate a particular fire. The example I'm using here is the 4 Mile Canyon 2010 fire. Gold Hill's located over here. You can put in the current climate and then ask for the model to tell you at a 30-meter spatial resolution what sites are suitable climate-wise, for reforesting, for planting with ponderosa pine. You could do it with Doug fir too. Or if you don't believe climate change is a hoax, you can look at a projected climate based on moderate emission scenario. And these are the sorts of projections that are being used all the time. This is sort of standard stuff now. And you can see the dark colors are the areas where climate is judged to be a very low suitability for survival of ponderosa pine. So this is important there, but there are some areas of moderate suitability. This is important in guiding managers to decide whether it's worth planting or not and where to try to plant. So finally, just to summarize, in terms of a pathway forward, my 2 cents worth. These are just my opinions. I think we need a lot better implementation of the Rad framework and elements that could be improved. I'm not saying this isn't happening already, but I think it needs improvement. We need a lot more monitoring. We need adaptive management, which really is willing to change course over time based on new information. We need a lot more pilot experimental studies. Specifically in our region, we have very, very few studies of assisted migration where we move species from, say, low elevations that are adapted to warmer, drier conditions to higher elevations. I think we need to do that on a much greater scale. We need expanded deliberations with stakeholders. Again, this is the kind of pretty intensive iterative process that can happen in these collaboratives that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And so I think that's a really very positive trend. And this is a criticism. I'm not criticizing the people, but I am criticizing the messaging. And that is, we need to avoid the narrative-based messaging that refers to even forest health. Even the term restoration is abused. That's an example of using sort of your goal without describing your methods. We certainly want to avoid using terms like overgrown forests, which convey nothing of scientific or ecological meaning. And we all, the practitioners, the scientists, and all the stakeholders need to insist that the conversation is driven by explicit goals with metrics to evaluate how we're moving towards those or away from those goals, and the evidence. So I've been bothered, by a lot of the very careless use of metaphors like the healthy forest. And my own take is that we should be prioritizing in terms of shifting resources, putting more financial resources into actual climate adaptation. So that's tree species and population protection, assisted migration, infrastructure for reforestation, as opposed to the chainsawing approach. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tim Seestat, to guide us through some questions and answers. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Good.
Thank you, Tom. That was almost overwhelming, actually. I'm glad this is being recorded because I tried to take some notes and filled up the page halfway through, and I'm going to have to go back for some details. there's a huge amount of information here. I'm guessing that the group to that, the communities at risk kind of is at a level, and given what you just said, am I correct in saying, okay, if you're in Netherlands, you just told me that high elevation systems, the fires are totally climate driven, not fuel driven. So essentially managing maybe for fuels up there is less important than playing the game down here in the foothills?
I think we have to distinguish within the upper montane zone, which would include Netherlands, the woolly areas. So I'm saying that in the areas that are distant from settlements, I don't think that the fuels reduction approach is our default to go to. I don't think it's going to be very successful. But imagine if you were living in Netherlands, it would be natural to support intensive fuels reduction. You know, we always start with the home ignition zone, but we need to expand that out so that we have real buffers from crown fires in those woolly areas. So I think, you know, the key sort of resolution that I've had personally is that we need some pretty drastic modification of fuels in areas like around Netherlands that will at least provide anchor points for firefighting operations. But you know, you get another, let's say you get a mile from Netherlands, then we would get into an argument with some people who would say, well, we want to reduce fuels there because, you know, you think the fire is going to get a big, you know, run at Netherlands from, you know, a long distance away. And that's where I would disagree that it's going to be practical. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, the exurban environment, the inbuilding throughout the Front Range is just scary to look at. But
I agree.
And beyond increasing your fire insurance, if you can get it, it seems, I don't know. We got a question here from Robert Grossman, which is the opinion, or asking how to relate the water resource runoff storage relative to the forest patterns that are ongoing right now.
Yeah, okay. Well, recent review paper on the effects of fires and water yields across the Western US concluded that there are short-term increases in water yields, but by short-term, just a few years after that, not necessarily a significant change. There have been some studies of the effects of the beetle kill on water yields. In my opinion, they've been inconclusive. Part of it is that scientifically, you can't easily come up with a controlled research design where you have a before and after with no change in all the other factors that affect the water yields. So watershed protection is a key issue in all of this, and protection of our municipal water sources is key. So that's where we want to prioritize protecting infrastructure. And there are modeling papers that have looked at the potential effectiveness of fuels reduction way upstream in large watersheds to try and protect areas that have been have suffered from severe sedimentation, very costly to fix, such as the High Park fire in the Larimer County area in 2012. And some of those papers actually come up with a conclusion that it would be a lot cheaper, but not cheap, but cheaper and more effective to depend on engineering solutions, even backup water processing systems, as opposed to trying to transform the entire Front Range into a fire-free zone. Because anytime we have these massive fires, we're going to have huge amounts of sedimentation. Again, that's the kind of thing that modeling exercises can help guide decision-making on.
Okay. So we got a question from David Kasoy. Can you unmute, David, to ask your question?
Right. I'm wondering what part of a tree is killed by pine bark beetles?
Yeah, the mountain pine beetles bore into the tree and they consume the phloem, the inner bark. And so that's essentially the same as girdling the tree. So mountain pine beetle and spruce beetle attack is almost always lethal, close to 100% lethal. If it's a successful attack of the tree, meaning that if the beetles are able to reproduce in the trees are a goner.
Okay, and does that mean that the pine, which part of the tree falls to the ground when these trees die?
Well, the entire tree gradually decays.
Yeah.
In the case of spruce, that occurs over a very long period of time. So where we developed our tree ring methods to detect previous spruce beetle outbreaks, we cored trees in the 1980s that had been killed by beetles in the 1940s. And most of those trees are still standing. So it's simply the large size of the spruce trunks, but they have shed their needles. They've shed, branches and so on. Lodgepole pine, simply because it's a smaller tree, tends to fall over much earlier. In terms of firefighting, if people wanted to go in on the ground to fight a severe fire in a lodgepole pine forest, which certainly is not advised, having all those fallen trees on the ground is a major obstacle.
So Alan, question, can you unmute?
Yes, Tom, I presume you've done quite a bit of hiking in our open space, and I presume your brain has been heavily engaged on how you're going to protect Boulder against a fire in our open space. And I think John Potter and I would really like to hear your ideas on that.
Yes, the Marshall Fire got all of our attentions. Yeah, as I pointed out in my talk, we know that our most extensive fires in the lower montane zone, actually upper montane zone too, have followed by a year or 2 years climate, wetter climate, moister, cooler conditions. And this is a finding that applies all throughout the southwestern ponderosa pine forest too, that it's the grass fuels, the fine fuels that are very important in limiting fire spread. So as I pointed out, a lot of the removal of trees is based on the observation that we don't want crown fires. We don't want embers from burning trees flying long distances, but we still are going to have a lot of grassland. So there are some parts of open space that have been grazed to reduce those fuels, which is known to be effective in this kind of ecosystem. There are going to be areas, smaller areas, say some of the open space areas surrounded by homes in Louisville, where people are going to want to mow. Areas out in Gun Barrel, owned by the school district, need to be mowed to reduce the fire hazard. That's where we had our very recent, relatively small fire in Gun Barrel. So, and there are some debates about that because the taller grasses provide some benefit as wildlife corridors. But from a safety perspective, I think that our society is going to be demanding that we either graze or mow these grasslands within a certain proximity of homes to try and reduce the possibility of fire spread, similar to what we saw in the Marshall Fire. Well, let me just add, and of course that's a very small part of reducing risk. The much more important part would be all the building codes, the regulations, something that I didn't want to talk about tonight. And there's been recent progress, but those of you who have paid attention for a number of years know that there's been a lot of resistance to any statewide building codes to address fire safety. But I'm optimistic that in the future we will be able to move forward with those sorts of building code restrictions.
So, Tom, would you be willing to sit down with John and I and discuss this further?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Sounds like fun.
Thank you.
Kim, how are we doing on time? We look a bit over. Do we?
Well, we still have a question from Lynn Siegel.
Okay, Lynn.
And may I ask my own question? There seems to be a interest in managing our open space in creating grassland savannas in terms of tree thinning. So there's a large separation between the trees with a lot of grass in between. What you pointed out is probably that's not very good in terms of fire management. Is that right?
No. Boulder City and County Open Space have been doing things that are entirely consistent with what we understand about fire history and fire risk. So as I tried to stress, the real goal of that management has been to reduce the risk from crown fires, high severity fires. The Marshall grass fire made everybody stop and realize, hey, wait a second, these grass fires can lead to high severity suburban fires too. So the management that's been done on city and county open space lands is really very well informed by the science. It's the upper montane zone and attempts to do similar things that have been proposed actually for the subalpine zone, say roadless areas and the Indian Peaks wilderness. Yes, that's where we really want to have some serious conversations.
Lynn, a question?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions fired up in my mind after Alan. Alan always gets me going. For one, we still don't have a causation on the Marshall fire, but I pretty well assessed that thing myself. I rode my bike all over that area. I wish my daughter could do a three-dimensional level fire. She does three dimensionals of the fire going up, but I like it to see it more go how it went sideways, because I followed it out the road where the church is, and I went behind in Marshall itself and went out that other, there's all these little trajectories, and then it just petered out. It was very strange. But mostly it went, you know, my theory, of course, is that the coal seam started, and it was, I heard that it was a low pressure day, which means the air sucks up, and air would have sucked up from that underground fire. You know, in Glenwood, they can't even, they had to evacuate, take down the houses, and can never, you know, this is like changing geology. You can't do it. So that would be a long-term concern. And then the way I figure, and I know those guys at 12 Tribes, and I knew about the fire that was videoed, and I put the whole thing together. And I think that the coal seam fire started, it lit the 12 Tribes garden shed on fire. It went out over the plains. It went over grass. And you brought this up, Tom, because you said one of these fires went really fast, like many football fields per whatever. You said that was pretty stunning to think how fast that fire could go. And this went on the plains out to Target and out, you know, there. Now, my other concern is Rocky Flats. My mom died of leukemia. She breathed in plutonium in 1957 in the first fire. And she died in '69, the second fire, the Mother's Day fire, ironically. I can't prove it, but leukemia, I'm pretty sure that's what happened. So I'm wondering, any thoughts? You know, Candela spoke, said they were going to mow 40 feet. What's that going to do in the fire like you described? What was the name of that fire that you described that really fast on the grassland?
Well, I was talking about the East Troublesome fire.
Oh, that was the
started near Granby.
Troublesome.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I don't, have information or expertise to really directly, comment on your questions, other than to observe that highly competent investigators are still working on the origin of the fire, and so hopefully they will share evidence of the Marshall Fire evidence with us. And I know that the whole concept of burning in the Rocky Flats area because of the potential of raising radioactivity has been quite controversial. But again, that's beyond my expertise. And
there's no public fire plan. There's a plan, but we don't get to see it.
Well, that doesn't sound positive.
I'd like to suggest we end the questions now. If we were in an auditorium, we could all applaud to thank Tom, but let's applaud anyhow. Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk, Tom. And Tim, thank you for engaging in that conversation. Our next talk is going to be on the 18th of June, where we have Marjorie McIntosh, maybe some of you know her, from the history department. We'll be talking about the Latino history of Boulder County. So I hope to see many of you at our talk in June. Thank you very much for coming.